Thank you for your kind introduction. I'd like to thank the Association for Borderland Studies for this invitation, but especially Machteld Wenken, whose elegant experimentation with unmaking borders is the reason I'm your keynote speaker today. So today I'd like to begin by, I'm going to talk about transboundary communities of commoning in environmental governance. And what I mean by this is the ways in which spatially dispersed communities mobilise and animate around a greater environmental good. They do so by exploiting porosities in borders through their generative activities and flexible solidarities that challenge the spatial performances and practices of bordering. But first, because my experiences draw heavily from examples in Southeast Asia, where I'm from, that may be unfamiliar to many of you, I'll begin with a story that brings our divided geographies together. This image here shows a palm oil plantation on the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. Currently, palm oil plantations are the leading cause of deforestation in Southeast Asia. They cover a landmass of around 5.6 million hectares, which is almost 2/3 the size of Hungary. Each year, these crops generate around 26 billion euros in profits, and the demand for palm oil is endless. Palm oil products are in about half the products we buy from supermarkets, ranging from chocolate to shampoo and toothpaste, and just about everything that lists vegetable oil as a generic ingredient. In addition to massive deforestation, palm oil plantations are driving greenhouse gas emissions because they're increasingly grown in carbon-rich peatlands or swamps, which are meant to be kept wet. When peat swamps are drained to prepare for planting, they become highly flammable. As such, the clearing of land to pave the way for plantations is a major cause of cross-border or transboundary air pollution, which in Southeast Asia is known as haze. The SOS letters that are chainsawed into this palm oil plantation were carved by a Lithuanian activist named Ernest Zakharevich, pictured here in the top left. Ernest travelled from Europe to Southeast Asia to challenge borders in the fine art world and in environmental activism through his public murals and land art installations aimed at drawing global attention to the deforestation crisis facing the world's rainforests. This SOS plantation, which was once lush rainforest, borders the Gunung Lusa National Park on the island of Sumatra, the last place on Earth where orangutans, Sumatran rhinos, tigers, and orangutans still coexist, and elephants. You see here on the right some of the location map of the Gunung Lusa National Park, and below some of Ernest's artworks produced in response to the large-scale degradation of this uniquely diverse ecosystem. In carving out this SOS art installation, Ernest worked in collaboration with local and international artists, as well as NGOs, and multinational businesses to formulate cross-border responses to the environmental impacts generated by the global palm oil industry. You see, SOS isn't just the International Distress Code for Humans. SOS is also the acronym of the Sumatran Orangutan Society, a charity based in Oxfordshire in England dedicated to helping around 14,600 orangutans remaining in the wild in Sumatra. Through the SOS campaign, Ernest, together with Sumatran Orangutan Society organisation, collaborated with the British beauty company Lush. For a short time earlier this year, Lush flooded European markets with limited edition SOS shampoo bars and orangutan-shaped soaps to raise funds to purchase the 50-hectare palm oil plantation on which this SOS message was carved for its future reforestation and biodiversity conservation. But the inspiration for the European expansion of the SOS campaign was set against a wide backdrop of multiple cross-border initiatives already in place in situated contexts across Southeast Asia. In Singapore, where I live, SOS students of Singapore Against Haze are actively involved in community outreach programs aimed at minimising the local impacts of transboundary air pollution caused by burning forests and palm oil plantations. SOS students of Singapore in turn connect outwards with other students in the region, such as Kids Cut Palm Oil based in Bali in Indonesia, and they also connect outwards and upwards to Singapore's People's Movement Against Haze organisation. PM Haze is a Singapore government-sponsored charity committed to bringing about incremental changes in the palm oil sector by working with Indonesian peatland communities and also Singapore-based businesses. And down here on the bottom right, you see one of the students' more successful public campaigns where they petitioned two of Singapore's most popular curry puff makers to stop frying our rainforests by planting palm oil plantations on forested areas. Across Southeast Asia, multi-stakeholder approaches to the search for cross-border solutions to the transboundary haze problem are inspiring other initiatives like the Fire-Free Alliance, a collaborative umbrella under which transnational organisations, community organisations and local and international NGOs cooperate in implementing fire mitigation strategies. The Asia-Europe collaborations around a common good that I've just described in relation to the SOS campaign represent what I call a transboundary communities of commoning. Here I use the term communities to suggest the solidarities and political identities that go into mobilising spatial practices around a common good, such as biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration and climate action. Of course, homogenising representations of community are themselves inherently problematic when they overlook power relations within communities based on gendered, ethnic, religious and other lines that produce highly differentiated capacities. So to avoid some of these pitfalls, I'll subscribe to an alternative etymology of community set out by Ashermin and Philip Howell of the idea of community as communis, the common public, that unites us not by what we hold in common, but rather by what we owe, our obligations to the wider habitats that sustain us. This approach to community is useful because it's suggestive of the generative activities that need to go into continually nurturing productive relationships across borders. Transboundary communities of commoning not only expose the fluid, open-ended and opaque nature of the border, but also its selective porosity in the activities that materially and socially reconstitute borders. Such communities do not simply statically assemble around common interests. In fact, the people who come together around common goods often disagree on the meaning of key terms that bring them together in the first place, like environmentalism or neoliberal institutions or globalisation. In the SOS campaign I described, for example, school kids, artists, civilian volunteers, agribusinesses and beauty companies all have very different, maybe even conflictual ideas about the environment. They come from diverse backgrounds with contrasting worldviews. But what unites them are their cooperative activities around reducing transboundary air pollution and wildfires, which, when undertaken together, render borders flexible and less significant. A key question for transboundary communities of commoning, then, is how this border porosity might be productively exploited to support progressive forms of environmental governance. In particular, how can cross-border communities help us to build commons connectivity by addressing shared problems like growing resource scarcity and transboundary environmental threats and crises? When I talk about the transboundary commons, I'm referring to two types of resources. In situ commons are physically located in a single jurisdiction, but governed by a transboundary coalition around a common environmental good, like climate action and biodiversity conservation. The second type of commons are mobile in the sense that they slip through the cracks in state control, such as migratory birds, fish, insects, river resources, and air, the atmospheric commons. In the spirit of the focus of this conference on applied aspects of border studies, let's look more closely at how communities of commoning navigate bordering practices in transboundary environmental governance. Like other people at this conference who have drawn from the work of Henk van Houten on enclosing bordering space, I'm also concerned with bordering both as the physical enclosing power of borders and the active geopolitical processes of reordering, parcelling, fragmenting, and enclosing natural resources. Whereas borders physically adjudicate the terrain of power over space of resource access, bordering practices produce value regimes and narratives of inclusion and exclusion. These practices and narratives determine the extent to which environmental commons are able to flourish within and between jurisdictions in direct and discrete ways. I'm treating both commoning and bordering as modalities of transboundary governance. Both sets of practices are relational in the sense that bordering and commoning actively transform in relation to each other to generate very specific spatial forms. Commoning and bordering also need actually existing communities to make and sustain spaces for collective action, without which neither borders nor commons could exist. The current inability of governments around the world to deal with cross-border environmental displacement and conflict calls for an alternative approach to governance that is rooted in the inclusive ethos of transboundary activism and solidarity. Despite regional and global attention to transboundary issues of air pollution, ocean eutrophication, and the cross-border impacts of climate change, the division of the world into nation states means that environmental problems continue to be treated primarily as domestic concerns. International law has made very little headway towards delineating the limits of state and corporate responsibility for conserving our common environmental heritage. We see this in the relative ineffectiveness of international legal frameworks and instruments in holding major perpetrators of environmental harm to account for things like oil spills and other forms of transboundary pollution. We also see it in the impotence of national governments in dealing with forced climate migration or climate refugees, currently conservatively estimated at around 25 million people and projected by the United Nations to increase to up to 1 billion people by 2050 due to desertification, rising sea levels, and extreme weather events and human conflicts over increasingly scarce resources. Part of the problem is that we need to stop thinking about transboundary resources as being clearly defined and having relatively stable and fixed boundaries. I've recently published this edited book here you see on the left with some colleagues, and our main argument is that we need to stop thinking about environmental resources as if they're spatially anchored passive entities around which governance processes naturally unfold. Air, for instance, can shift shape and transform into an environmental good, into a transboundary flow of environmental harm when it transports gases and particulate matter across borders, turning into transboundary pollution. The flow of water similarly defies enclosure. And, like air, water is malleable, migratory, and even potentially transgressive in its transformation from a life-giving resource into a perpetrator of complex disasters with compound impacts. The environmental commons, wounded by the multiple stresses inflicted by anthropogenic transformations of nature, are pushing back to incubate and spread transboundary disasters, which then boomerang back into the heart of dense urban settlements. A paradox of this dual representation of commons as both a victim of human interventions into nature and as a perpetrator of complex disasters is that governments and corporations alike are increasing their efforts to capture and contain shared resources through various forms of enclosure, such as through national parks, privatisation and land grabbing. Another problem with governing transboundary resources is that people often possess conflicting information on different sides of the border. When spatially dispersed populations do not coordinate information, they tend to engage in practices that adversely affect things like the seasonal movements of migratory species and sustainable harvesting rates. So here, for example, you see when urban development obstructs the pathways of swamp turtles or construction cranes encroach on the nesting grounds of migratory crane birds, then there are clear implications for the overall conservation outcomes of entire species. Unfortunately, in many parts of the world, environmental change is outpacing what information we possess about geographically dispersed habitats, reducing our collective capacities to protect environmental commons and to deal with cross-border flows of environmental harm. In Asia, for example, a wave of dam building along the Mekong River, which snakes through 6 countries, has all but eliminated intra-annual variations in the hydrology of the river at the local scale. This means that our existing knowledge, based on past experience of the Mekong's natural rhythms, is now entering unknown territory. Transboundary decision-making processes about river governance remain largely piecemeal and incremental, concealing whole basin or whole river effects of multiple blockages and storage effects over time. In the lower part of the Mekong, which supports the livelihoods of some 60 million people, sections of the river have stopped moving entirely. Sediment and nutrients required for riverbed regeneration have halted. The river's flood pulse has fundamentally altered, and this has disrupted the movements of some 130 species of migratory Mekong fish. This in turn interrupts transboundary commoning strategies that are based on temporal, seasonal, wet and monsoonal and dry season movements, and less fixed notions of the commons that require multi-sited geographies of upstream and downstream fisheries coordination to protect regional food security. At this point, I'd like to zoom in on some of the organisational levels at which transboundary communities of commoning are mobilising their activities, ranging from grassroots and neighbourhood associations through to cities and the extended urban regions, nation states, and the regional and international level. I think that thinking about these activities can lend insights into the sorts of participatory pathways that are shaping alternative forms of transboundary governance, and when activities at one scale tend to jump scale to connect with other initiatives. At the grassroots level, Indigenous, gendered, feminist, rural and urban poor, eco-religious, eco-spiritual and Marxist voices have invoked the universalising politics of commoning to forge cross-border communities. What many of these diverse communities share in common is their assignment of a cultural logic or a more than economic value to natural resources, as opposed to market neoliberalism. Because grassroots communities share unique histories and identities deriving from specific, often non-anthropocentric relationships with nature, their views on the value of shared resources may be at odds with other users of the same resource, even within the same jurisdiction. So for this reason, in 2003, a UNESCO Convention on Safeguarding Intangible Heritage was introduced to embed traditional knowledge systems, often based on oral traditions, within wider policy discourses as a means of protecting common resources that can be valued both as cultural goods and as commodities. The circumstances that originally give rise to grassroots communities of commoning are often the same conditions that lead local actors to seek out transboundary support. Grassroots actors tend to tap into transboundary communities when no domestic remedy is readily available to resist the threat of enclosure of collective resources, or to achieve legal redress for real or perceived injustices wrought by invasion or capture of the commons. We see this, for example, in the ways in which Indigenous communities are using spatial information technologies to retain access to their communal homelands. They do so by mapping alternative borders that were once only conveyed via oral traditions or mental images through intergenerational knowledge systems. This map of my home country, Australia, is home to more than 500 nomadic Indigenous clan groups whose relationship with their homelands is at odds with our fixed post-colonial borders. To prevent the spread of pollutants from some 400 operating mines on their lands, Australia's Indigenous peoples are invoking counter-cartographies to contest mineral extraction projects planned by big mining companies. Such counter-cartographies are highly politicised because they aim to establish the legitimacy of competing territorial claims that are based on continuity in human-nature relations. In many societies where grassroots commoning claims surface, the experiences of colonisation and recolonisation are deeply rooted in the spatial and social reproduction of unequal geographies. This colonial legacy carries with it a denial of traditional resource rights and the dispossession of communal homelands, often for the benefit of metropolitan expansion. Emerging from a position of marginality, situated communities thus forge transboundary alliances as a means of uniting and empowering the disenfranchised. These commons sometimes include the invocation of a post-colonial politics of resistance, which has gained traction among Marxist activists in seeking to break down borders produced by class interests, often centred on localised forms of distributional justice and post-colonial subjectivities. For instance, we see this in communities invested in alternative forms of food production like co-ops and community agriculture. And just because these communities look local and sound local, as suggested by their choice of self-descriptors like local and community, doesn't mean they are locally bounded, because many local communities are firmly embedded in transboundary movements. In fact, decisions about when to operationalise transboundary communities at the local scale and when activities should jump scale to connect with allied cross-border initiatives are highly political and often imbued with moral and ethical considerations. So, for example, the local exchange trading scheme that emerged in Manchester, UK in the early 1990s invoked a deliberate localising strategy to facilitate the West European expansion of this transboundary alternative currency network through spatially dispersed grassroots movements that were philosophically committed to an anti-globalisation environmental ethos. At the level of cities and extended urban regions, a multidisciplinary literature on transboundary environmental commoning has evolved, in part, in response to the worldwide transition from rural to more urban societies. In densely populated Asia, transboundary rural to urban migration is especially pronounced, fueled by population growth and meteoric development. As you can see, there are more people living inside this circle than outside it. Inequalities are rapidly growing as cities swell to incorporate burgeoning populations through unsafe planning and inappropriate development. This produces new social vulnerabilities as environmental threats and impacts are unevenly experienced, all too often resulting in poor people being blamed for living in slums instead of wider governance failures. But what this loss of communal lands, livelihoods and rights has also done is add political fuel to the viewpoint that ordinary people, that is commoners, can reclaim a sense of community and ownership by commoning urban resources. What we're seeing in megacities across Asia is this sense of commoning through encroachment, a term coined by the Indian sociologist Depleting. Too often, poor rural migrants need to hunt, forage and gather to survive in cities by encroaching on resource-rich sites like rivers, thereby creating an alternative map to the transhuman city. While such informal practices typically function below the level of the community, considering how transboundary rural migrants are continually remaking cities from below through inputs into domestic and transnational commodity chains, provokes questions about collective rights to urban commons. How then should we interpret the right to the city through transboundary communities of commoning? Increasingly, urban communities in developing countries are leveraging wider scales of anti-privatisation partnerships to oppose the corporate exploitation of common water resources, thereby challenging city boundaries. The perceived failures of privatising water have mobilised public sector unions, civil society organisations and anti-globalisation think tanks, often with ideologically diverse backgrounds, around their shared defence of city water commons on the global stage. As you can see from these images, these rallies are demographically very different, but their anti-privatisation water democracy message is a connecting narrative. The growing prominence of urban-based transboundary communities of commoning has policy implications that extend well beyond the concerns of urban sustainability. Cities are emerging as progressive spaces for cultivating transboundary communities through their relative density of knowledge systems, ideas and technologies, around which a vast array of relationships take seed and flourish. The trend towards decentralised governance in Asia, Africa and parts of Latin America in the past few decades has seen city administrations, rather than national governments, emerging as engines of policy innovation in responding to cross-border environmental threats and crises. City-level transboundary activism has even tried to provide redress for higher scales of ecologically unsustainable behaviours. So last year, for example, 70 mayors of American cities responded to Donald Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change by vowing to uphold Paris targets within their own jurisdictions, while another 30 cities pledged to obtain 100% of their energy from renewable sources. At the national scale, transboundary communities are distinguishable from lower levels of commoning collectives in at least two ways. First, countries seek to open up borders as a means of strengthening sovereignty by establishing bilateral and transnational relationships aimed at managing resources that are seen as national assets on both sides of the border. By contrast, grassroots and urban communities often come into being through politics of resistance that subvert or unsettle sovereignty when borders seek to degrade or destroy commons. Second, national governments, unlike transboundary communities at lower spatial scales, are automatically conferred international legitimacy as brokers of societal interests within their borders and in regulating resource externalities of the state system. These two unique features of commoning at the national scale have led to the production of transboundary commons that are formally protected by bilateral and international agreements. Transboundary border parks, transfrontier conservation areas, and peace parks offer examples of how neighbouring countries work together to neutralise sections of their borders in the service of conserving overlapping resources. Transboundary governance frameworks around payment for ecosystem services have also been established between countries to conserve the habitats of migratory species and river resources by offering financial incentives to landowners to manage their properties in ways that provide some sort of wider ecological service. So on the left here, you can see an example of bird-based tourism in the Americas, where national governments work through the US-based National Audubon Society, which in turn works with local NGOs, to protect migratory bird habitats through community-based birding holiday destinations. At the international scale of transboundary governance, communities of commoning are often diffuse, intangible, and hard to recognise. A critique of higher scales of conservation efforts is that they often lack communities of real people who attend to the everyday labour of making and maintaining commons. Too often, regional and global communities are reducible to signatories of international agreements that lack sufficient detail and attention to contextual specificity to be readily operationalised and enforced. This means that the commoning work of regional and international organisations tends to find relevance and community through engagement with local partners. To succeed in this process, international organisations must tailor their programs to local realities, just as situated communities of grassroots organisations in search of transboundary support, need to be at least tactically or ideologically open to acknowledging areas of compatibility with outside agendas. I'll give you an example of how this works in Indonesia's almost homogeneously Islamic province of Aceh, which was devastated by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. This village of Lampok is where I did most of my field research for my PhD in the years before the tsunami, and it was reduced from 7,000 people to 1,000 people in the aftermath of the disaster. This village mosque is the only building that was left standing, which, as you can imagine, is hugely significant for people coming to terms with a legacy of loss and social trauma within an Islamic worldview. As part of the reconstruction phase after the disaster, Aceh's eco-Islamic groups worked together with the secular World Wildlife Fund to rehabilitate damaged mangrove swamps as a buffer against future big waves and tsunamis. The WWF, in approaching its restoration work in Aceh, consulted the Birmingham-based Islamic Foundation for Ecology and Environmental Sciences to ensure that its Aceh programs were sensitively articulated through the lens of Islamic values. This was essential within the context of disaster recovery and within Aceh's transition to Islamic law or Sharia. Without the unifying glue of Islam, WWF conceded that its post-tsunami programs in Aceh could not have proceeded with Aceh's support. So what's important in examining these transboundary relationships across vertical and horizontal scales of socio-ecological interest is the ways in which communities of commoning are reframing the problems of the commons while expanding the range of tools that might be deployed to address it. Yet such communities are also extending out across territories out of necessity. The work of creating and connecting commons cannot be done within organisational silos, just as commoning activities do not naturally fit into bordered spaces. Transboundary communities of commoning, therefore, represent an attempt at a logical organisational formation through which to theorise and frame policy responses to cross-border threats and crises. So by way of conclusion, I'll just return to my original example. The SOS campaign that I described at the outset is not simply a work of art in a bounded palm oil plantation. Rather, it is constitutive of the generative activities that go into forging transboundary communities around a greater good. These communities are not static or bound by fixed values in common. In fact, these flexible communities often share nothing in common beyond their shared commitment to a particular cause. In the SOS community I described, the international and local artists often don't have much in common with each other, let alone with the school kids of varying ethnicities, religions and backgrounds, and civil society groups covering the entire socio-economic and demographic spectrum, as well as NGOs, multinational companies selling diverse products and their subsidiaries. But what they do share in common is that they exploit border porosities through their participatory activities aimed at sustaining shared resources and addressing cross-border environmental problems. Ultimately, the inability of governments around the world to deal with regional unrest arising from environmental crises and displacement calls for an alternative approach to environmental governance that prioritises commons connectivity over spatial practices of bordering common pool resources. We need a lot more research on the sorts of generative activities involved in sharing resources that defy borders and fixed spatial imaginaries. The new geography of commoning signals a departure away from traditional understandings of bounded resource domains and a shift towards recognition both of our wider resource dependencies and the dynamic transformative properties of transboundary resources. Spatial and strategic adjustments reflecting these resource mobilities need to be made in transboundary environmental governance if we are going to better support the communities who are engaged in the everyday struggle to reconnect commons in a world bordered by competing spheres of human interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.